my land acknowledgement go?
Hi everyone, welcome to the Clark Historical Museum, and my name is Dana. I am the Marketing and Events Coordinator, and thank you so much for coming here today and being here to see Jean's talk. I'm going to give a brief introduction, and I'm going to make sure I pronounce your last name correctly. Pfaelzer, yeah?
Got it.
Yes.
First time.
Jean Pfaelzer is the author of Driven Out, The Forgotten War Against Chinese Americans, which is what her talk is going to be about today. And she's also the author of the forthcoming The Stolen People, The History of Slavery and Slave Revolts in California. Driven Out was named one of the 100 notable books of the year by the New York Times. Jean was on the curatorial teams for I Want the White American and Chinese American Women, A History of Resistance and Resilience at the National Women's History Museum. She appears in the 2018 PBS 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act and the PBS CCBS in China special on Chinese immigration. She also writes for Huffington Post, History News Network, and The Globalist, speaks on NPR and Pacifica on labor and immigration. She's currently Professor Emerita of English, Asian Studies, Women and Gender Studies at the University of Delaware, and was previously Executive Director of the National Labor Law Center and Senior Legislative Analysis in the U.S. House of Representatives, focusing on immigration, labor, and women. So quite the resume, and this was only about a third of it, I think, so there's a lot more. After the talk from 3 to 4, we're continuing the Year of the Tiger celebration with a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the naming of the alley Charlie Moon Way. That's going to be taking place over at the parking lot of the Central Coast Credit Union. And there's also going to be lion dancers there to help bless the Eureka Chinatown project, historic Chinatown, and the new alley name. From 4 to 5, we're having Chinese lion dance business blessings. They're going to walk around Old Town and perform blessing ceremonies. So keep a lookout. They're going to be dancing in the museum at some point between 4 and 5. And then from 6 to 9 during Arts Alive, the Tiger Street Festival in front of the museum with lion dancers, Lao dancers, taiko drums, a kid zone, food trucks, artists, and more. So we have quite the day planned, and this is a wonderful way to start it. And thank you, Jean, so much for speaking here today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Today is, am I mic'd? Did this work? Oh, great. Hi, I'm Jeannie Pfaelzer, and today is really a day that commemorates what happened to Asian Americans and Chinese Americans up here in Humboldt County. But it's also a day of celebration where, with the incredible support of the city of Eureka, the alleyway that marks the Chinatown that is no more is going to be renamed after Charlie Moon, who was one of the people who managed to remain in Eureka. Settler notion of Eureka, we found it, we got it. So may we work to make this place one where we can all sit and rest, especially after the week we've been through, while paying respect to those whose land we are on. And my book was written for a huge part up in Big Lagoon, where we've been for on and off, but on and on and on more lately. And that's, it was written on Yurok land. So that'll come up in my talk. This is the image that was drawn by, some of you may remember Ray Wang, who was the one of the librarians at what was then HSU until very recently, as a poly move at HSU. Just want to make sure the humanities and the context for science gets honored and held at Cal Poly. And Ray had this calligraphy painted, and I can tell you that every time I show it, different people who are literate in Mandarin have different interpretations of how correct, flawed, how it could be improved. And I am not literate in Mandarin, so I can tell you that it represents driven out, the Chinese called the over 300 routes in California the driven out. That's where my title comes from. And in Cantonese, it's Pai Hua, the driven out. And the symbol represents the hand for to push, to force, and then this also represents the sword, which you can kind of see the beauty of Chinese and Mandarin calligraphy, the sword of the violence that happened to the Chinese people. Jay? That's not a Mandarin word, it's me getting a little help from my new friend here. In the 1970s, a million years ago, with my then 6-year-old daughter, I moved into a cabin in the woods in remote Humboldt County, California, to begin my career as a professor of English and American Studies at then HSU. From Big Lagoon, a little community of empty beach cottages, damp in the gray light of the North Coast winter, I daily drove south, past the jagged rocks and the dark old-growth remaining redwoods at Patrick's Point, through the fishing village of Trinidad, past sober white egrets who would be guarding the fern meadows, and enjoying the 65 inches of rain which fell each year in the county. And I'd finally crossed the Mad River and climbed the hill to Humboldt State in Arcata. Nestled in the redwoods between Oregon and the fishing town of Eureka, HSU borders the marshes that fade into Humboldt Bay. In the 1970s, and this was my first teaching job, I was still finishing my dissertation, and it was one of those new jobs where every bit of it was contingent. Sabbatical replacement, not even adjunct, minimal pay, and a sort of vague 2-year commitment to me. But I was born in LA, grew up in LA, and I looked around my classroom at HSU. I'm having a hard time getting over the HSU title. I looked around my classroom and there were no Asian kids. And growing up in LA, that had not been the world I grew up in. And I started to ask around, where are the Asian kids? And perhaps not surprisingly, some people hadn't noticed. Nobody could give me the answer of where the Asian kids were. And finally, one local poet said, Chinese Americans will not send their kids to HSU because 100 years ago, there was a roundup and a purge of the Chinese community in Eureka, and they wouldn't send their kids at that time to HSU. I fell in love with Humboldt County. That's my husband back there. When I met him, I brought him out. That's Peter. I brought him out as a test. Like if he and his son didn't fall in love with Big Lagoon and Humboldt County, I was going to have to move on because that's one of those non-negotiables. And they did, and we did, and we've been in Big Lagoon for most of the year, or as much of the year as our work will allow, ever since. And with this love that I deeply have for Humboldt, I knew that there was this troubling, vexed story that needed to be told. And eventually I thought, okay, I owe it to my love for this county to find this story and tell the story of what happened in Eureka. And as I do, I went down to the Bancroft Library at Berkeley, and back then it was rolling the microfilm readers. The elderly, or as one of our kids would call us, the olderlies amongst us, would remember the microfilm before we could do this in our jammies, online. And what I discovered in my first afternoon at the Bancroft was that over 80 roundups happened in California, and that spurred me on. I went back to Delaware, where I teach, and spoke to one of my Chinese American colleagues and said, I was going to write this article, maybe I was going to write my first novel, and he just said, Jeannie, with what you found, you either do this, your research yourself, or you turn it over to the Chinese American community. You can't just write your novel based on our story. And I got it, and it took about 6 years, and I believe I was in almost every county in California, looking through their archives, and often having to convince them that something happened in their county. And they would say, no, it didn't happen here. And I became like the Johnny Appleseed of archives, and I was just photocopying and leaving in all of these libraries or historical societies information about what happened in their county, and eventually, with many, I think I need to go out for a hamburger, I'll be back, and I would come back in, and very often there was a library table full of clippings and archives and local documents, that this stuff was buried alive. It was buried, this story was just under the surface. It really wasn't hard to find because so much happened and so much was documented. Jay? Okay, that's Trinidad, that's the old pier, and that's part of the story I just told. Next. The first Chinese woman that we know who came to the United States was Afang Moy, and Afang Moy was brought to be put on display in the 1850s. And she was schlepped around New York. She went as far as Chicago. People would pay 50 cents to see her, and she would sit there, and she represents, in my view, what we now call Orientalism, of looking at Asian people as different, as other, as artifacts. And she would sit for about 20 minutes. Her feet were bound, so they'd be very painful. And she would demonstrate using chopsticks. She would speak a little Cantonese. The paper said Mandarin, but unlikely. And the room was full of mahogany furniture. And at this time, Chinese artifacts were really expensive. They were really valued. Sometimes you can see these really tall Chinese vases, and often they're blue and white. Sometimes they're multicolored. So Chinese artifacts were valued and were very costly at the time. It was Chinese people who weren't. And in some ways, Afang Moy becomes one of those artifacts who was traveled around and put on display. And at some point, I believe she goes back to China, but her story disappears, and people are looking for her story. The story I'm going to tell today is very gendered, that there's the man story and the women's story. And this played out because Chinese men chose to come to California. Waves for people always give me the creeps, but the Chinese men came either for the gold rush, and they came the way people from all over the world and the East Coast came to California to make their fortune, to be young, to have an adventure, to get away. And it was a time of great poverty and destitution in China. Often a village would get together and raise enough money to send a likely kid, or a family would, to California. They often came in a small family group. And so the first group of Chinese men who came voluntarily. They chose to come, and the Chinese people went back and forth to China to have a family, to take stuff home, to be in touch with their village. And part of their loan or their contract to come was that their bones would be returned to their villages for burial. And we can talk about the bones if we have time, but that was always a back and forth. And then with the building of the Transcontinental Railroad that starts during the Civil War, it ends, I think, in 1869, when white people did not want to do that work for such crummy pay, that brokers were sent by Crocker Bank, and Stanford, Leland Stanford, Stanford University were funding the railroad, and they sent brokers to hire Chinese men to come do the work on the railroad. So those are the two big groups of Chinese men who come. Unlike my relatives and my dad, who could not go back and forth, he was born in the Ukraine, and it was not, his family would have been taken into the Tsar's army and enslaved. So when they came, my family couldn't go back and forth. But other groups, the Irish, when they came, could legally go back and forth, but there wasn't the money to travel back and forth. But for the Chinese, it was an assumption. Home, village, family, heritage was possible and built in. So there was a great deal of back and forth to China. Jay? This is the map that I made of the number of roundups in California. There are over 200 on this map. I know there are over 200 because I had to go back to Office Depot and buy some more little red dots. But there were about 300 roundups in the United States, starting in Seattle, Tacoma, Oregon, Wyoming, and then it seeped into the South and it seeped into the East Coast. But the majority of them were along the Pacific Rim. So my challenge was, one, to understand that there were two histories, the men's history and the women's history. And then the second one was to find these history, and then the third one was to write it. And it was such a vast, big, complicated history that it wasn't like take pen in hand or keyboard in hand and the story just flowed. The women's history is different. The women, about 95 to 96% of the Chinese women who first came to California were kidnapped from the coast of Guangdong. That California, what's going on in California from the 1850s through the 1860s is the Native American genocide, where settlers are coming in, farming for ranching, for gold, for fishing, for lumber, and there wasn't, the land was under the stewardship as most Native Americans think of their relationship to the land. They don't think of land, most of the tribal people do not think of land as property that they own. This is land of where they live. And they didn't have a concept of private property or ownership. And so the genocide that goes on, there's a wonderful book by Ben Madley on the genocide in California. And so the genocide is going on during the entire period that we're going to be talking about today. But the peak of it is the 1850s, and it ends during the Civil War. The number of tribal people is reduced in California. The numbers are unclear, but it's about 310,000 Native American people at the point of contact when the Spanish come in for the missions. And by the end of the genocide, the number is about 16,000. So from 310,000 to 16,000 people. What that meant for people, for the settlers, the white settlers coming in, is that there wasn't a labor force. But also most of them were men. And there were very few, aside from the tribal women, there were very few white women who had the least desire to come here. There were many who were adventurous or learning their stories. But this wasn't a trend. And so the Chinese Six Company, the merchant class, sends brokers to China to kidnap and bring Chinese women to come to work as prostitutes. And they're enslaved, they're not free, they sign 4-year contracts. It was illegal to do this also in China. And so the money would be given to the girl, who would hand it generally to her father or to the village head for her purchase. And she comes here under a 4-year contract. And so my talk is split in two. There's the men's story and the women's story, because they're just very, very different stories, although they suffered much of the same. Jay? This was from Crescent City. It's the only sign like this I was able to find, but it's the sign of the story I'm about to tell. Mass meeting of the citizens of this place and vicinity will be held at Darby Hall on Sunday. This sign was actually from 1886, the year after the purge in Eureka, to devise some lawful means of ridding Crescent City of the Chinese. And everybody should come to this meeting so we can make a plan of how to purge the Chinese people. Jay? The first Chinese then who come are gold miners, and these are men. My grandfather didn't know how to do laundry. He'd been a peddler in the Ukraine. So the laundry was not a success. My grandma knew how to cook, and so her boarding house, where people didn't service sector, is an immigrant tradition and an immigrant necessity. And we don't really have a good history yet, although we're all working on it, of the first Chinese who come into Humboldt County. We know that they come after the gold rush, and then when the railroad is finished, then they trickle down from the mountains. Many stay in towns like Marysville, Sacramento, Eureka, have the birth of Chinatowns. The Chinatowns differ, and there's one really important thing that's relevant to our story today, is whether or not they were allowed to own property in their own name. And in Eureka, the Chinese were not allowed to own property in their own name. They had to rent. And so that gives a very tangential and scary relationship to a town, to know that you can be evicted. Nobody expected the purges, but that you could even be evicted like that because you don't own the property. And now that we're doing, as a country, thinking about home and people who are homeless, people who don't have, or people who are unhoused, there's a long tradition of the vulnerability, the very deliberate vulnerability, in my view, of what happens to people who don't have homes. So this is the origin of the men coming into Eureka and starting Chinatown here. And I think that the photographer, it's very interesting. This thing is called a long tom, and it's a way of sifting through the dirt. Gold is heavy, it wouldn't float to the bottom. So, but even visually, to have the segregation that we see in this image. Jay? This is a cartoon from Harper's, and what you see is white, woo, okay. I'm a klutz, it'll happen again. All right, so what you see is white settlers moving in and Native Americans being driven out, and with a settler with a very large axe or pickaxe, you know, really kind of the focus of our attention, the tallest, biggest person in the image. But people knew that this transition, this human displacement was happening. Jay? So the idea of purging Chinese people very quickly becomes institutionalized. One of the first laws passed in California, and it's passed, we become a state in 1849. We write a constitution that says, the deal is that we can be admitted as a slave state. Back to high school history, one free state, one slave state, to be admitted so that slavery would endure in the new territories. And one of the first laws passed in California is the Foreign Miners Act, and it's an extra fee for foreign people who are going to be gold mining. And it starts as $2, $3, and then it goes up to $20 a month, which was an impossible fee. So add this on to the vigilantes who are purging Chinese men from the gold fields. Tax collectors would ride through the gold fields. Some of them were scam artists, some of them weren't tax collectors at all, rounding up or taking money from Chinese people. So that's, actually I made somebody take that down from the wall of a museum. They pointed out, one of the people working there is, you're entitled to have it, you're a taxpayer. So you can have anything in this museum you want. So I said, well, I want that. So that's the foreign miners tax. Jay? Another way that Chinese people were targeted was that when they came and docked, they were strip searched for opium. Opium was not a Chinese tradition initially. Opium was all over the world, but opium was grown in India. It was part of the British Empire, the profitability of the British Empire. But it's the Chinese people, white people, like my dad, my grandpa, were not strip searched at Ellis Island for opium. That this was a way of targeting Chinese people who are strip searched. This is at the dock in San Francisco. Opium was legal, and it was the sort of Valium of the day, the pot of the day. It was sold in tinctures, in bottles. It was called laudanum, and it was advertised in all the papers, and it was really especially targeted to women who, and in the West, they were lonely, they missed their family, they were depressed, they were unemployed, and it was a big deal about either smoking opium or drinking, knocking back laudanum. But it's in all of the women's magazines of the 19th century to buy laudanum. But here, the Chinese are frightened and targeted for importing opium. Jay? The first real violence against the Chinese people was in Los Angeles. The most brutal and the most massive what was then called Negro Alley, which was the downtown LA. It's where LA's train station, Union Station, is now, was built over it. But this was Chinatown. I can't perfectly date it, but I believe that's the Telegraph. So the Telegraph gets popularized during the Civil War. So we know it's some point after the 1860s. But by 1870, the anti-Chinese sentiment is running rough in Los Angeles. What happens is there's a wedding. And it's a wedding between a Chinese girl, her name was Yahit, and Yahit is from a different village and clan from the man she's marrying. At the wedding, there's a little scuffle because of the marrying across clans. Word goes out, riot in Chinatown, and ranchers and farmers and field workers from all over, especially from the orange groves, rush down into Chinatown in Los Angeles. It's now 1871, and it's a harsh story. And food and celebration at Lunar New Year's, but gamblers are going to come up here, and we want the same protection everybody else has. The Eureka police ignored them. There is this shootout, and we believe that it was between two Chinese men in the crossfire. A councilman, David Kendall, is shot and killed, and a little white boy is wounded. And immediately 800 people gather in what was Centennial Hall. Ironically, it was built for the centennial of the Declaration of Independence in 1876, and they gather there. And it's like, what are we going to do about the Chinese? And they have a series of motions. The first motion is murder all the Chinese. Didn't sit so well. And the second motion is burn Chinatown. But Ricks is the white guy, and he owns it. He's out of town, but his peeps say, you can't burn Chinatown. Ricks owns it. And so the third proposition is the one that wins, and it's that there's 24 hours to purge Eureka of all of the Chinese people. So this is, by now it's after dusk. This meeting has happened. A committee is sent out into Chinatown to tell the Chinese people they have 24 hours to pack up and go. And that's what happens. And so the sheriff commandeers some wagons, but I don't know about you guys when you move. When we move, it's going to take more than a wagon to furniture. They had fishing boats. There were shrimp boats. A lot of Chinese people were shrimp fishermen up here. The town relied on the Chinese to grow vegetables, so there were vegetables in the ground that were people's labor, and they also had a value. And the town depended on the Chinese vegetable growers. For one cold, brutal night, they're taken down to the wharf starting in the middle of the night, just at sunup, under guard by the sheriffs and by vigilantes, marched down to the pier. And Jay, next. And they wait for ships to carry them away. At this time, there were always ships going back and forth between San Francisco, stopping in Eureka. Some went on to Crescent City, and they were mail ships, food ships, transportation ships. There was no north-south road. We didn't have 101, and there was no railroad. We still don't have a railroad between here and San Francisco. And so the only way to purge people was by sea. And this was one of the ships. It was the city of Chester. There was also the ship called the Humboldt. Normally there would only be one in Humboldt Bay, but like what we've seen this week with the tour boat coming in, that the ships, both of the ships are stranded in Humboldt Bay because the tide wasn't right for one of them to sail. So without any regard to family, to relationships, to parents and children. The Chinese are loaded onto these 2 ships, and it takes all weekend with very little of what they owned are loaded onto these 2 ships, and they sail down to San Francisco. They finally sail on Sunday night. The wind was from the north. Up here, that's generally good news. And they arrive in San Francisco on the Monday morning, very quickly. And they get there before the customs house, the immigration center, is opened. And they flee off of these ships. They know exactly what's going to happen at the dock. And they go into Chinatown, escape into Chinatown. That afternoon, that Monday afternoon, at 3 in the afternoon, they call a meeting. And I mean, when I think about the weekend they've been through, the purge, the loss, the fear, where are my people? Where's my family? Where are we all going to stay? This is over 300 people who've been rounded up as far as vigilantes could track them and brought into town. At this moment of fear, they call a meeting and they make a historic announcement. It's historic in American history. And they make an announcement that says, we are going to sue for the injuries done to us. In my sense as a historian, this is the first lawsuit for reparations. And it happened here. It's called Wing Hing versus the city of Eureka. Jay? The Chamber of Commerce very quickly issues a pamphlet that boasts white people should come immigrate to Eureka because the only county in the state containing no Chinamen. So they're boasting of this achievement. Jay? All right, this is impossible to read, and I know documents are boring, but it's so historic that I'm sticking us with it. And this is the lawsuit, Wing Hing plaintiff versus the city of Eureka. And in this lawsuit, 52 Chinese people are suing for reparations. And it took me a while to figure out. In fact, I'd wake Peter up in the middle of the night going, what's a tort? Why isn't this a tort action? Which is like, if somebody does damage to you and you sue them, that's a tort action. But what raises this to reparations is they're suing for mob violence done to them as a people, as a community, and for being, quote, the victims of mob violence. And he had to teach me over and over again, and I worked with some other law professors to help me be able to make this claim that this really is the first lawsuit. And it's that language. We're not only demanding our stuff or payment for our stuff, which is a tort, which in my mind is still something with not enough flour and not enough eggs, but it's a tort action. It's not that. It's reparations. It's a demand for repair. Reparations is justice that repairs. And that's what this lawsuit, that's very boring to look at, is. And if anybody wants a copy, we now have copies of the full lawsuit. Jay? The violence that has happened here and in Los Angeles is big news. And this is an era of people who are Christian, for the most part, white people, and they're shocked by the violence, or they don't have the nerve to do it themselves. It's a whole combination of factors. But up in Truckee is this guy named Charles McGlashan. He wants to be the next governor of California, and he can't run on a violence ticket. He's the editor of the Truckee Republican newspaper, and his plan is to starve them out. And it takes more time than a night. It took 6 weeks, and no one in Truckee, and this is by shame, not by city code, is allowed to rent to, buy from, sell from, hire, or in the words that he disperses, have any intercourse with, and that means exchange of money, hiring, with a Chinese person. And so it takes 6 weeks. Truckee's a railroad town, so every night as the trains come in, a few more and more people, and there were over 1,100 Chinese people living not only in Truckee, but living in the woods. The railroad sucked up a lot of wood, so you needed a lot of woodcutters. Hence, Chinese living rough in the woods. Some of the people who come to their support are the butchers, who realize they're being starved out, and they leave little packets of meat along the trails for the Chinese people who are going to try and stay. The woodcutters are all hired by Crocker, who built the railroad, and Crocker is begging the town to stop. Don't do this. We need these people. We need their labor. We need the wood. The whole transcontinental railroad needs that wood, but racism wins out, and it takes about 6 weeks of starve them out for the purge to happen. At the end, that they burn Chinatown, and they invite the women to come sit on the balcony of the Palace Hotel and watch the fire and watch the burning of Chinatown. It's a big party. And what they don't realize is that 2 Chinese men have refused to leave, and they're hiding in their basement. At this point, the Chinese in Truckee, if many of you have been to Truckee, you know, it's the river runs through it, and they're hiding in their basement. The paper said they were hiding with silver. That doesn't make sense to me. I think they were hiding with gold, with whatever gold they had, and they die in the fire. When I went to talk about this in the old opium den, and I'm going, well, that's kind of cool, and I'd never been in an opium den. And I said, but that can't be because Chinatown was burned to the ground. And they said, no, it was in the white part of town. So my talk was in the opium den. It looked kind of like Shishi, San Francisco, you know, open plumbing and open red brick walls. But they had preserved the opium den in the basement in the white part of town. Jay? There are no large numbers of Chinese left in Humboldt County. In 1886, in honor of the anniversary of the purge, there are purges in Arcata, in Crescent City, in Ronerville, in Fortuna, in Ferndale, until the county becomes really, really white. And what happens in 1906 is that a cannery needs Chinese, very skilled salmon cannery workers, and they build a little portable cannery in the Eel River for the salmon run, and they hire a group of Chinese people for a 6-month contract. And they sign the contract to bring in this group of Chinese people. And the day they arrive, there's a big hoop-to-do in Eureka. The Chinese are back, the Chinese are back. So now and the purge is brutal, and they round up the Chinese people, and they keep them on, Jay? Tuluwat Island. And so for me as a Jew, just the image of people detained in boxcars is, although I know there's a lot of historic difference, I can tell you that this image really is very powerful and tragic to me. It's been colorized. Thank you to the Clark, who did a beautiful job of colorizing these images. And you can see this little girl, she's all dressed up to go stare at the Chinese who are being held in boxcars on Tuluwat, which at that point is called either Gunther Island or Indian Island. The name has not been restored until the Wiyot were given back most of the island. And so it's The difference, though, is that there's this contract, and this time the Chinese won't leave until their contract is paid in full. And so, in fact, they've been here for about 10 days, counting the time on Duluwat, until a ship comes from Astoria to take them away. And so when they leave, next, please. This is the barge carrying them from Duluwat to the ship that's going to carry them back to Astoria, Oregon. You can see how few possessions they have with them. That's the old Sequoia Yacht Club in the background. Jay? Other ways of purging the Chinese. This is San Jose. There were 5 fires in San Jose. San Jose kept burning Chinatown to the ground over and over and over again. Finally, a German landlord says enough is enough, and he owns the land that faces City Hall. And he says, okay, we're going to rebuild Chinatown, smack in the face of City Hall. And he hires, with his own money, the architect that's building San Jose City Hall. So this beautiful, very elaborate, but it suits, you know, it's going to be the match of San Jose City Hall. Of the fires, and you can see here all of the folks who've gathered to watch Chinatown burn for the 5th time. What happens in San Jose is that they burn Chinatown. It's sort of in my mind like the story of the 3 little pigs, where they build it out of bricks so that it can't be burned down. And they have very narrow openings, and they're guarded to get in and out of San Jose. And the Chinese file a lawsuit against police harassment. And if we have time, because I know I'm already out of time, we can talk about the lawsuit, but it's also one of the first lawsuits in the United States against police harassment filed by the Chinese in San Jose. I'm going to just charge through the women's stories. Jay, can we go? All right, why did this happen? Fear of job competition. In fact, there was none. The one place where there was job competition was in the cigar rolling factories, where both Chinese people and white people worked. Other than that, white people did not want the jobs that Chinese people either had the skills to do, the dynamiting skills, ditch digging, or were willing to take the kind of work. Next. This is Chinatown, the first Chinatown in Sacramento. This was when I asked myself, and I have for years, why did this happen? Why was there so much hate? And I turned to the Asian American theorist David Ng, who says that the hate came years of poverty, unemployment, hunger, that they're really attacking the dream that didn't come true for themselves. And it makes sense to me when I see this picture of the first Chinatown in Sacramento. Next. This was the image of Chinese. It's called A Picture for Employees. Here's white working class domesticity. It didn't look like that. You know, clean with the wifey and the little kid and the kitten and the string. And then Chinese men in what was supposed to be an opium den. That's not what opium dens look like, but it's a very erotic pose. And I believe that a lot of homophobia was involved in the hatred of Chinese men. They were smaller than white men. They wore a very long braid. They have less hair than Caucasian men. And many of the wealthy Chinese wore long robes. And so it was easy to pitch them as feminized. And if you look at this picture of the way all of their legs are entangled around each other, it's really a very hostile but homoerotic pose. Next. We can skip these. We're running out of time. Another way to mock the Chinese, and this is after the Civil War, is to construct them and paint them as African American. And so you'll see dozens of cartoons where there's this very hostile overlay of an African American and a Chinese face. Gosh, I got this critter lassoed right enough now in thunder. How am I going to get him back to China? Next. This was a toy gun, a cap gun. It was built for children. It's this big. There's one at the Smithsonian. You can buy them now on eBay. And there was a real interest in mechanical toys, so you pulled the trigger, and the stereotype of an Irishman with the paddy hat, you pulled the trigger and he kicks the Chinese man in the rear, pulls on his cue, and the cap goes off. So I call this one Teach Our Children Well. Some of the old people will know the song that comes from. And in the town of Red Bluff, there was an anti-Chinese children's parade that got organized. It really was, as we're seeing now, what's happening in textbooks in the South, the idea of teach our children something else. Next. There was also this, it was an era of social Darwinism, a mockery of evolution, and so the monkey evolves through the Chinese men and ends up in the figure of the pig, which is a Chinese symbol for luck and prosperity. It's one of the Chinese New Year names. Next. We'll keep going. Another way that the Chinese were targeted was to make it impossible for them to survive and thrive. This was a Chinese laundry. It's from up on Butte Creek, and the law was that you couldn't build a laundry in a wooden building. So that meant everything in Northern California was made out of wood. In Southern California, it was made out of sand or early versions of stucco. So if you couldn't build a laundry made out of wood, it was a way of deporting people and making it impossible for them to survive. Next. This is from here, and it was a Chinese man delivering vegetables. The town was completely dependent on, people didn't want to take the time to grow food, and that job fell to the Chinese population. And the law was that, and it starts in San Francisco, you couldn't deliver anything on a pole that extended from your shoulders, which made it impossible for the Chinese community to thrive. It also starves out the town without people being able to deliver food. Next. All right, I'm going to very quickly, can I have a few more minutes?
We do have to hurry because the musicians are waiting and they have to leave at 2. But what time do you need to leave?
Whenever we're starting over at the mural, so.
That starts at 3. So how much more time do you need?
Oh, the story goes deep. But all right, I just want to briefly then tell the women's story, and then we'll finish up. So the women come enslaved. They are captured in China. Their contracts are allegedly for 4 years, but between syphilis, rape, sexual violence, hunger, they didn't live out the contracts. Some of them were able to run away. This is from up in the gold country, and it's a slave den where Chinese girls are bought and sold. Jay? This is on Jackson Street in San Francisco. The brothels where the girls were sold, depending on what you wanted them to do, they were sold for starting at 50 cents for what was called a lookie. There was this myth that Chinese women's sexual organs, reproductive organs, were different than white people, and that their vaginal slit was horizontal rather than vertical. And so men paid 50 cents for this, quote, lookie that was anatomically not true. But the girls were sold from cages. They would solicit a guy. They would sell their bodies for sometimes up to 100 people a day. The idea of having 100 sexual imaginable, the destruction that would do to these women. And so the madam, who was the wife of a Chinese merchant, would draw the curtain, the woman would service the man and collect the money, open the curtain, and on to the next one. Next. This is a local woman. The photograph comes from our local historian who has passed away, Peter Palmquist, but his records were incredibly accurate. And this is marked as a Chinese prostitute, and it's really interesting. This is a studio photograph, not an outdoor photograph. By the 1880s, people had cameras. Kodak is, everybody was getting cameras. But this was not a typical immigrant photo that you sent home, and I think it was a trade card. What's weird about it, there's so much that's wrong with this picture. Her feet are bound. Poor women did not have bound feet. You couldn't work, you couldn't walk, you couldn't run. You were really decorative. So her feet are bound, so she wouldn't have come from a poor family. This kind of odalisque pose is not a typical immigrant pose, and but it was a very erotic pose. If you know the paintings of odalisque, lying on a divan or a sofa with her hand to her face, would have been seen, and with her legs showing. This is the era where white women are still wearing, despite the fact that horses poop in the street, they were still wearing very long dresses and did not display their legs. So it's at the pose and her legs make it a very erotic pose. These are chrysanthemums, and in the 19th century Chinese culture, they were symbols of purity. So who put that bunch of chrysanthemums by her? Were they trying to sell her as a virgin, that she's a symbol of purity? Or did she put that there to reclaim some honor and integrity for herself? We don't know. Jay? This is a partial picture, but it's of white women looking at a child prostitute. Chinese girls, females, were sold from the time they were babies up through their teenage years. The most expensive was a 16-year-old girl who would sell for $3,000 in 1880s money, which would be hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's money. There was a lot of money changing hands with the Chinese prostitutes. Next. This is sheet music from the Library of Congress, and I just blast it for its racism and its stereotypes of a Chinese girl marrying an African-American man by what I describe as a figure of an Uncle Tom, performing the wedding of the Chinese and the coon. It's racist all over the place. What I didn't get is that this is one of the first musical comedies in the United States. But what I really didn't get was the lyrics. It was the celebration of an interracial marriage. And the lyrics are counter to the cover, which these guys didn't write the cover, and it says, "Come to a wedding. This is a celebration of a wedding that has never been held before." And it's the celebration of an interracial marriage, which was in 1880 in California against the law for there to be interracial. If we look at this week's court case and we look at what was not in the Constitution, is the Loving case, which was the right for interracial marriage. And this music